Good morning, class. You are welcome to our today's class. And in today's class, we are going to discuss the biochemistry of carbohydrates. We look at the properties, structure, and uses of carbohydrates. And your presenter is Madam Nancy Wadika. So when you're looking at the carbohydrates, we need to know the following objectives. One, we have to define carbohydrates. Two, we have to state the importance of carbohydrates. Three, we have to explain the properties of carbohydrates. And four, we'll classify carbohydrates. And lastly, we can see if we can describe the general properties of monosaccharides. In our definition, carbohydrates are polyhydroxyaldehydes or ketones or substances that yield such compounds on hydrolysis. So these carbohydrates have elements. And for us to know the elements, the carbohydrates have the general formula CH2O in bracket N to mean it is a long chain polysaccharide. So we say for us to identify those elements, then C will indicate that they contain carbon. They also have hydrogen and they have also what you call the oxygen. Then we have the properties of these carbohydrates. I mean the importance of the carbohydrates. What do we use these carbohydrates for? Number one, carbohydrates act as energy reserves. They store fuels and metabolic intermediates. Two, ribose and deoxyribose, those are form of carbohydrates. They normally form the structural frame of genetic materials like RNA and DNA. We also have another category of carbohydrates that is polysaccharides like cellulose, which normally form the structural elements in the cell walls of bacteria and plants. So we have some carbohydrates are always linked to proteins and lipids, and their role will be to form the cell interactions. And then some carbohydrates are also organic compounds. In other words, we say they are aldehydes or ketone, and they form what we call hydroxyl groups. So these carbohydrates normally will have their sources. Where do we get them from? So sources of carbohydrates are cereals, stem tubers, milk, sugarcane, and any other source that could contain glucose in the structure. Then we can also look at the general properties of carbohydrates. So number one, these carbohydrates form what we call stereoisomers. Stereoisomers are compounds that normally share the same structural formula, but they have different spatial configurations. So example, we have glucose has two examples of isomer with respect to what we call the penultimate carbon. And this is in glucose, we'll see it as carbon number 5. And they are D-glucose and L-glucose. Another property is optical activity. So these carbohydrates, they normally, these carbohydrates normally rotate in plane polarized light, and they form what we call a dextrorotary or a devorotary that will give us a positive or a negative glucose. Another property we have is diastereoisomers. So some carbohydrates have different in their configurational changes with regards to either carbon number 2, number 3, or number 4 in glucose molecules. So for example, you have a different in structure of mannose and galactose. Though they are same, they have the same number of carbon atoms, they differ in their spatial configuration. Another property is the anomerism. Again, this property is also talking about the spatial configuration with respect to the first carbon atom. And this will give them either aldose or ketose sugars. Again, another thing that I want us to look at is the classification of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are classified into three main classes. Namely, we have monosaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. But if you look at the oligosaccharides, we have to realize that I've given there three examples, like the oligosaccharides could be in the form of disaccharides, trisaccharides, and tetrasaccharides. So in this classification, when you're talking of monosaccharides, it means they have only one sugar. Oligosaccharide will have more than 2 sugars, but less than 10. And then polysaccharides have sugar molecules from 10 and above. Then when we started looking at these classes in details, we start by monosaccharides. So these monosaccharides are simple sugars, which consists of a single polyhydroxyaldehyde or ketone unit. The most abundant monosaccharide in nature is the 6-carbon sugar, that is the D-glucose, sometimes referred to as the dextrose. And oligosaccharides consist of, I said earlier, consist of short chains of monosaccharide units or residue, and they are joined by a characteristic bonding that we call the glycosidic bond. And the most abundant disaccharide that we know will normally have 2 monosaccharide units. For example, we have sucrose. We can also have others like maltose and the rest. So another category that we mentioned earlier of, class of carbohydrates is polysaccharide. And these polysaccharides are sugar polymers containing more than 20 or so monosaccharide units. And some have hundreds or thousands of these monosaccharides. Example we know is starch. And then we have physical properties of polysaccharides. The physical properties there will correct. We are dealing with the monosaccharides, so we should talk of the physical properties of monosaccharides. So we can derive it from the word monosaccharides. Is derived from the Greek word that means mono, means single, and saccharide that means sugar. They have the following general properties, like 1, they are simple sugars, 2, they are sweet in taste, and 3, they are soluble in water, and then 4, they normally form crystalline structure or crystalline in nature. We can also add the fact that they contain 3 to 10 carbon atoms or 2 or more hydroxyl groups and 1 aldehyde or 1 ketone group. To mean the monosaccharide will either have an aldehyde or a ketone, but never both. So if you want to understand the property, then you can pick the picture of a glucose and then you label the picture of that glucose. So our class will end there. Any question? Any question from whatever we've discovered? So who can, for example, state for us a given property of a monosaccharid that you can remember, class?
Monosaccharides are soluble in water and they are sweetest.
Thank you, Samson. Monosaccharides have sweet taste and they are soluble in water. Any other observation that somebody can also put? Any observation? Any other comment? Yes, class. Are we still there?
Yes, I have got a question.
Okay.
Is there any other macromolecules which can yield energy apart from carbohydrates?
Yes, thank you for that question. We'll discuss that in our next topic when we are talking of proteins. We also have other micromolecules like lipids, but they're not commonly used in the production of energy due to some reasons that we'll cover when we are dealing with proteins and lipids. Thank you for that question. Any other? There being no other question, I beg to stop there, and we meet in our next online class. Thank you so much for attending the class.